The sun rose over the majestic city of Carthage, casting its golden light upon the temples, markets, and grand amphitheaters where life and death intertwined in brutal spectacles. Amid its cobbled streets and the bustling voices of merchants, a community lived in the shadows, marked by its unwavering faith in a God who could not be seen, but spoke in the hearts of those who followed him. It was the year 203. Emperor Septimius Severus had decreed the persecution of Christians, a sentence that fell like an axe upon those who dared to defy the traditions of Rome. Among them, 2 women would become emblems of a resistance fought not with weapons, but with faith and sacrifice. Perpetua, a young noblewoman of just 22, had grown up surrounded by the luxuries of a wealthy family. A mother to a newborn child and possessing an indomitable spirit, her heart beat with a conviction that neither her lineage nor the pleas of her father could break. Beside her was Felicity, her slave and friend, who, despite her humble status, shared the same hope in eternal life. Felicity was pregnant, facing a double anguish: the arrival of her child and the certainty that martyrdom awaited her. When they were arrested and locked away in a dark, foul-smelling prison, they knew their fate was sealed. Neither Perpetua's noble blood nor Felicity's expectant womb would be enough to save them from the destiny that awaited Christ's followers. Yet in that darkness, their faith burned like an inextinguishable torch. From the shadows of their prison to the relentless light of the amphitheater, their story would not be one of defeat, but of glory. It would not be the tale of 2 victims, but of 2 souls who embraced eternity with superhuman courage. Perpetua and Felicity would not be remembered for their fear, but for their bravery, not for their death, but for their victory. This is the story of Perpetua and Felicity, 2 women who defied the empire with the most powerful weapon, faith. A testimony of absolute love, of boundless surrender, and of a conviction that neither beasts nor executioners could break. Dawn bathed the streets of Carthage in golden light, but inside the house of Viva Perpetua, the brightness of day could not dispel the shadow of uncertainty. The young woman, barely 22 years old, held her infant son in her arms, gazing at his face with indescribable love. She knew that destiny was calling her, that her faith would lead her down a path of trial and sacrifice. The question was not whether she was willing to face it, but whether her heart could bear the pain of separation. Since embracing Christianity, Perpetua had felt a peace that neither the luxuries of her noble upbringing nor the privileges of her status could grant her. But she also knew that this peace came at a price. Rome would not tolerate the followers of Christ. Emperor Septimius Severus had ordered the persecution of Christians in Africa, seeking to eradicate the burgeoning faith that spread like an unquenchable fire. Rumors of arrests and executions filled the city. In the squares, people spoke of believers thrown into the arena for the entertainment of the crowd. It was said that in the dungeons, Christians were cruelly interrogated in an attempt to make them renounce their faith. But Perpetua did not fear. In her heart, God had given her a certainty. Her life belonged to Christ, and no imperial decree could change that. That morning, as she fed her child, her father entered the room, his face drawn with anguish. His eyes reflected the fear and desperation of a man about to lose his daughter. "My daughter, I beg you." His voice broke as he approached her. "Think of your mother, of your family, of your son. Do not do this. There is no need to die. Just say the words, and you will be free." Perpetua lifted her gaze and took her father's trembling hand in hers. She loved him deeply, but her soul was resolute. "Father, do you see this water jug?" The old man nodded, confused. "Can it be called anything other than a water jug?" "No, my child, of course not. It is what it is." Perpetua smiled gently, but in her eyes burned an unbreakable strength. "Neither can I be called anything else. I am a Christian. I cannot be anything else." Her father turned away, feeling that the battle was lost. Before he could insist further, a loud noise shook the house. The Roman soldiers had arrived. The door burst open violently, and a group of guards entered with firm steps. At their head, a centurion read from a scroll, his voice cold and implacable, accustomed to delivering sentences. "Viva Perpetua, in the name of the emperor, you are under arrest for treason against Rome." The air grew heavy. Her father fell to his knees, pleading with the soldiers not to take her away, insisting that she was nothing more than a naive young woman, a mother who only wished to raise her child. But the guards showed no mercy. They seized Perpetua by the arms and tore her away from her family without hesitation. The cries of her child echoed in her heart as she was led away from her home. Her mother and brother watched in helpless sorrow, their faces marked by the pain of separation. Among the prisoners taken that morning was Felicity, her slave and friend who shared her faith. Her swollen belly revealed her advanced pregnancy, but even that would not save her from the fate Rome had reserved for them. When their eyes met, the two women understood that they would walk this path together. The prison they were taken to was a grim place, where the stench of despair filled the air. The cells were narrow and damp, and the echoes of other prisoners' laments filled the darkness. Perpetua was pushed into a cold cell, feeling the weight of her chains for the first time. But it was not the prison that burdened her heart. It was the absence of her child. Days passed in darkness, accompanied by her father's pleas, who returned more than once to beg her to renounce her faith. But Perpetua did not waver. She knew that her suffering was great, but her reward would be greater. Days later, her child was brought to her for a brief moment. As she held him in her arms, time seemed to stop. Her little one looked at her with innocence, unable to understand why his mother was behind these bars. Tears streamed down her face as she kissed his forehead. "Do not fear, my child. God will watch over you." When he was taken away, Perpetua felt something inside her break. Yet at the same time, an unusual peace filled her soul. She knew that martyrdom awaited her, that her destiny was written, but she was not afraid. That night, when the prison fell silent and the guards succumbed to sleep, Perpetua knelt on the cold stone floor and lifted a prayer. "Lord, give me the strength to walk this path without fear. My life is in your hands." And in that moment, she knew that this was only the beginning of the trial, but also the beginning of her victory. The prison of Carthage was not merely a place of confinement. It was an abyss where despair reigned, where time vanished amid screams and sobs. Inside, the stone walls dripped with moisture, and the air was thick with the stench of sweat-drenched bodies, rotting straw, and the looming presence of death. Yet in the shadows of this hell, two women stood as banners of faith. Perpetua and Felicity were not prisoners of Rome. They were prisoners of the love of Christ, and their will would not be broken. When the iron doors closed behind them, darkness engulfed them completely. The first days were the hardest. Perpetua, separated from her child, felt as if her soul was being torn apart. Her milk-laden breasts became a constant torment, a painful reminder of the infant she had left behind. But she did not weep. She knew that if she faltered, the guards would delight in her suffering. She refused to grant them that pleasure. Felicity, beside her, bore a different burden. Her swollen belly made her an easy target for mockery. The jailers laughed at her, saying that watching a pregnant woman die in the arena would be the most amusing spectacle of all. But she did not waver. With unshakable calm, she embraced her destiny. The nights were cold, filled with the murmurs of sleepless prisoners. The fear of death seeped into every corner, but in whispered prayers, Perpetua and Felicity found strength in each other. Then, the moment arrived. One night, Felicity felt the first pains of labor. She doubled over, whispering prayers as agony tore through her like burning iron. Perpetua knelt beside her, holding her as the slaves stifled her cries, refusing to give their tormentors the satisfaction of hearing her pain. One of the guards sneered, leaning against the iron bars. "If you cry like this now, what will you do when they throw you to the beasts?" Felicity, her face glistening with sweat and her lips trembling, lifted her head. Her eyes, ablaze with faith, burned with an unbreakable fire. With a steady voice she replied, "Now I suffer. In the arena, Christ will suffer in me." The guard fell silent. In that moment, even the weight of his armor seemed insignificant before the invisible strength of that woman. Shortly after, in the dimness of the cell, Felicity gave birth to a baby girl. The infant's cry rang out like a victory amid the suffering. Life had been born in a place of death. Another Christian prisoner took the newborn and secretly carried her to a believing family who would raise her. Felicity, exhausted but steadfast, smiled with serenity. Love had triumphed over fear, but with her childbirth, any hope of delaying her sentence vanished. Now, she was fit to die. Days later, the jailer handed Perpetua a wax tablet. With steady hands, she began to write her testimony, leaving behind a legacy inscribed in words. Each stroke was an echo of her faith, a silent cry that would transcend the centuries. "We are not prisoners of Rome. We are free in Christ." The sun began to filter through the bars. Soon, the order would come to lead them to the amphitheater. The arena was waiting. The air in the prison was thick, heavy with despair and the stench of death. The days passed with cruel slowness, and the night brought only the echoes of prisoners' laments, the sound of chains dragging in the darkness, and the fear that dawn would bring execution. But for Perpetua, the night was not an abyss of anguish. It was the moment when God spoke to her. That night, after a day of interrogations in which she was begged to renounce her faith, Perpetua lay down on the cold stone floor of her cell, closed her eyes, and in the depths of sleep, she had a vision that would mark her destiny. She saw herself standing before a narrow staircase that ascended toward the heavens. It was made of gold, but on each step, sharp thorns threatened to tear the flesh of those who dared to climb. On either side, demonic creatures lurked, serpents with gleaming fangs, beasts with burning eyes, and warriors holding bloodied weapons. The path was dangerous, but at the top of the staircase, an indescribable light shone. Perpetua knew she had to climb. She took the first step and felt the thorns cut into her feet, but she pressed on. With each step, the shadows tried to make her fall, whispering words of fear, reminding her of her son's cries, her father's pleas, the wrath of Rome. But Perpetua did not waver. Her heart burned with the certainty that this staircase was her path to eternity. When she reached the top, a shepherd dressed in white awaited her. His face was serene, and his gaze radiated a peace that surpassed any earthly torment. Around him, a host of saints and angels surrounded her, their smiles filled with an unshakable glory. In his hands, the shepherd held a golden chalice, and at the sight of it, Perpetua felt all the exhaustion of her climb vanish. "Come, Perpetua, I am waiting for you." She took the chalice and drank from it. In that instant, an immense peace enveloped her. She understood that death was not her end but her coronation. There was no reason to fear. God was waiting for her with open arms. When she awoke, the prison was the same. The darkness, the stench, the dampness clinging to her skin. But something within her had changed. There was no anguish in her face, no tremor in her heart. She knew her fate was sealed, and in her soul there was no fear, only certainty. The next morning, her father returned. This time, not with anger, but with desperation. He knelt before her, trembling, his cheeks streaked with tears. "Daughter, please, you don't have to do this. Look at your son. Don't leave him without a mother." Her father's words struck her like a storm. Her maternal instinct cried out to hold her son, to cling to life, to flee from this cruel fate. But then she remembered the staircase, the chalice, and the voice of the shepherd calling her. Her heart was strengthened. She leaned toward her father, placed her hand on his face, and with a voice full of love and resolve, she answered, "Father, this is not my choice, it is my destiny. I do not belong to this world, but to the one I have seen beyond." Her father looked at her with a broken heart. He knew there was nothing he could do to change her decision. Sobbing, he stumbled away, disappearing into the shadows of the corridor. It was the last time he would see his daughter. That night, Perpetua took the wax tablet she had been given and, with steady hands, began to write her testimony. She knew she would not be here to tell her story, but her legacy had to remain. Her words were not of lament, but of victory. "I have seen the glory of God, and He awaits me at the staircase of eternity. I will not renounce my faith, for Christ has called me by name." The guards shifted uneasily at the entrance of the prison. Even they could sense that something greater than the will of Rome loomed over this woman. Time was running out. The amphitheater awaited. The scorching sun of Carthage illuminated the arena of the amphitheater, where thousands of spectators eagerly awaited the day's spectacle. In the stands, senators, merchants, and commoners mingled in an excited clamor, murmuring bets and predictions on how long the condemned would last before succumbing. For them, death was entertainment. For Perpetua and Felicity, it was the gateway to eternal glory. The prison doors opened with a metallic screech. A group of prisoners advanced in a single file, their hands and feet bound in chains, escorted by soldiers whose spears gleamed under the sun. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the stone walls, a somber herald of their fate. But among them, two figures walked with a dignity that defied even their executioners. Perpetua moved forward with her head held high, her white dress billowing with each step. She was not a prisoner. She was a queen on her way to her throne. Beside her, Felicity kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her body still weak from childbirth, yet her determination remained unshaken by pain. As they emerged from the tunnel into the arena, the roar of the crowd engulfed them. Mocking shouts, cruel laughter, the sound of cups clashing as the spectators prepared to enjoy the spectacle. A senator eyed Perpetua curiously and murmured with disdain, "Look at her bearing. She does not seem like a condemned slave, but a goddess descended from Olympus." A guard approached them with a cynical smile. "Pray to your God now, for he will not come to save you." Perpetua looked at him with compassion, her eyes shining with the certainty of one who had already seen the fate that awaited her. "We do not need to be saved. Our God is already waiting for us." A horn sounded from the high tribune, signaling the beginning of their torment. The Colosseum gates swung open, and a raging bull stormed into the arena. Its breath was a growl, its dark hide glistened under the sun, and its fury erupted instantly. Without hesitation, it charged at Perpetua with brutal force. Her body was flung through the air and landed heavily on the sand. The crowd held its breath, expecting to see her writhing in agony. But when the dust settled, Perpetua was already standing. With a serene gesture, she gathered her hair, as if ensuring that her death would not appear an act of despair, but of willful surrender. The courage in her face made even some spectators lower their gaze. Felicity, too, was struck down, her body rolling across the blood-stained sand, but not a single cry escaped her lips. It was not weakness that ruled her spirit, but the certainty that the end of her suffering was near. The crowd demanded more. They wanted more blood, more spectacle. The governor nodded, and the executioners were summoned. A young soldier approached Perpetua, his sword trembling in his hands. He had never seen anyone face death without fear. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his weapon, but his grip wavered. Perpetua looked at him with tenderness. She smiled. "Do what you have come to do." The executioner swallowed hard. His hand trembled. He had never killed someone who looked at him without hatred, without pleading, only with love. With a final act of mercy, Perpetua herself guided the sword to her neck. The blade flashed under the sun, and in that instant the crowd fell silent. What they had witnessed was not an execution. It was a coronation. Felicity's body fell moments later. They had not died as slaves of Rome. They had triumphed as daughters of God. As the spectators began to disperse, unable to explain why an execution they had so eagerly awaited had left them with a lump in their throats, the Christians, watching in secret, exchanged looks of awe. They knew that on this day they had not witnessed a defeat. They had witnessed a victory that would echo through the centuries. The roar of the crowd faded, leaving behind a heavy silence, as if even the arena itself understood that it had witnessed something greater than death. Perpetua and Felicity had fallen, but they had not been defeated. Their bodies lay on the blood-stained sand, but their souls had already ascended to glory. The spectators began to leave in silence. Some carried with them the thrill of the spectacle, but others departed with darkened expressions, unable to comprehend why these women had not begged for their lives, why they had walked toward death with a peace that no executioner could take from them. The image of Perpetua guiding the soldier's sword remained etched in everyone's memory. As the bodies were removed, a group of Christians watched from the shadows. They were disciples of the faith that Perpetua and Felicity had defended with their blood. That same night, under the cover of darkness, they recovered the martyrs' bodies and buried them in a secret place. They did not weep for them, for they knew they had attained the ultimate victory. That night, in the catacombs of Carthage, their story began to be written. Day after day, the account of their martyrdom spread like fire throughout the city and beyond its walls. In the homes where Christians gathered in secret, their names were whispered with reverence. The scroll containing Perpetua's testimony passed from hand to hand, engraved in the memory of the faithful, in every prayer murmured beneath the veil of secrecy. One of the Christians who had witnessed the execution, deeply moved, wrote with trembling hands, "Perpetua guided the sword of her executioner with her own hands. Felicity did not tremble before the blade. Both laughed in the face of the world's horror and embraced the light of God. May their example illuminate those who come after." In the days that followed, the Christian community gathered in secret to remember their sisters in faith. They no longer spoke of them with sorrow, but with pride. Their martyrdom had been their victory, one that no emperor could erase. With time, the story of Perpetua and Felicity was recorded in manuscripts, preserved in the letters of the early Christians, and read in the gatherings of the faithful. They became symbols of resistance, a testimony that faith could defy even the power of Rome. Their names began to be invoked in times of tribulation, in moments of persecution, as a reminder that faithfulness to Christ was of immeasurable worth. Decades later, when Christianity was finally accepted within the Roman Empire, churches were built in their honor, and their names were inscribed in the annals of the church. But their legacy did not end there. Entire generations found in their sacrifice a reason to stand firm, to remain steadfast in faith, to remember that true life does not end with death. It begins with eternity. In Rome, in Carthage, in every corner of the empire where the name of Christ was whispered in secrecy, their memory burned like an unquenchable flame. They were not forgotten. They could not be forgotten. And so the arena of the amphitheater became the altar of their glory. They did not die as slaves of Rome. They died as daughters of God. Their story is not merely a tale of the past. It is a call to courage, an eternal lesson that faith lived to its fullest consequence can illuminate history and transform hearts. Their sacrifice continues to inspire, for the light of God never fades. The centuries have passed. The walls of Carthage have crumbled, the amphitheater lies in ruins, and the names of emperors and governors have been lost in the dust of time. Yet the story of Perpetua and Felicity remains alive, echoing in the hearts of those who seek the truth beyond fear and suffering. Their martyrdom was not an end, but a beginning. Their names were not silenced by the executioner's sword, nor did they fade away amidst the cries of the crowd. They were engraved in eternity. Their courage became a beacon for the persecuted, their love for Christ a flame that no torment could extinguish. What Rome had sought to suppress became an immortal testimony, a spark that ignited the hearts of generations of believers. From the day of their martyrdom, their story has been told in every corner of the world. In times of persecution, Perpetua and Felicity stood as proof that faith is not to be bargained. In times of doubt, their legacy reminded many that God calls His children to something greater than earthly security. Monasteries, churches, and cathedrals were built in their honor. Saints, kings, and humble believers have found in their example the strength to face life's storms. For their story does not belong to the past. It is an eternal echo that continues to resonate in every soul that chooses Christ over the world. Today, their legacy continues to inspire. In a world where faith is still tested, where sacrifice often becomes the measure of true love, the story of Perpetua and Felicity reminds us that darkness never has the final word, that fear cannot overcome hope, that those who give their lives for love of God receive an existence that death cannot take away. Their martyrdom was not a tragedy, but a victory. It was not a defeat, but an eternal triumph. They did not die in the arena. They were born into eternity. Saints Perpetua and Felicity, witnesses of faith and martyrs of Christ, pray for us.